Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of your favorite daily public policy podcast, the Takshashila Institution's All Things Policy. And today we're recording a very exciting episode with the Associate Director at Pew Research Center, Mr. Jacob Poushter. We're really delighted to have him here for this episode because he's going to help us unravel the mysteries of how Pew conducts surveys, how the logistics of different survey methods impact people's responses, and how trends and patterns observed from Pew's very famous annual surveys play out, especially when these trends and patterns revolve around either difficult geographies or sensitive issues such as religious preferences and political polarization. Most significantly, we're also excited to hear from Mr. Poushter regarding the trends and patterns Pew surveys may have observed when it comes to how countries in our neighborhood view India and Indians. And then listeners can feel free to draw conclusions with regards to how policy can kind of accept those perceptions and shape itself accordingly. I'm delighted to welcome you to this episode, Mr. Poushter. And without further ado, we'll just get into things, right? So one of the most interesting surveys that I had the opportunity to peruse recently, and it was conducted by Pew between January and March this year, was a survey on how Sri Lankans, Bangladeshis, and Indians view each other, right? And the results were very interesting, but can we come to you to understand some of the key trends and data points that emerged from these survey outcomes? And maybe more specifically, could we also have your thoughts on how differences in these perceptions of Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, Indians, and even Pakistanis play out between each other across parameters such as levels of education or religious preferences? Over to you.
Great. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to talk about all the research that Pew Research Center does, including the piece that you mentioned. So I'll just start off with that. As you said as well, this is part of a survey that we do every year. This past year, we did it among about 36 countries. And as a part of that survey, we like to go in depth in countries or regions every year just to kind of take a pulse of the temperature on various issues. And for this particular research item, what we did is we asked people in India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh whether they have a favorable view of the other country. So in India, we asked whether they have favorable views of Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. In Sri Lanka, we asked about Bangladesh and India, et cetera, et cetera. And we also asked about Pakistan, which is a country we did not do a survey in, but we have data on attitudes tour. And generally, we find that, among Sri Lankans and Bangladeshis, they have fairly positive views of India. 65% of Sri Lankans have a positive view of India, and 57% of Bangladeshis have a positive view of India. I will say that we conducted this survey in the spring before the Prime Minister of Bangladesh resigned, before there were protests around her rule. So it's important to keep that in mind, that this data is accurate as of around March of this year, but attitudes might have changed because of what happened in Bangladesh. So that's the top line numbers and views towards India. In general, people who supported the Prime Minister of Bangladesh in Bangladesh are more positive towards India than those who didn't support the Prime Minister. And also in both Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, those with more education were more likely to have favorable views of India than were not. So those are the data towards India. But we also asked about Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, if you would, want to talk about that data as well.
Yeah, no, I think that will be really interesting to also understand from you. I mean, of course, the caveat that you talked about with regards to the evolving situation in Bangladesh is very important to keep in mind here because I think at this point it's conventional wisdom that yes, the Sheikh Hasina regime in Bangladesh was, had very friendly relations with India, and even under her tenure, India-Bangladesh relations progressed fairly well, right? And a lot of important issues were resolved. So these are results that kind of help us really make sure that, and not just at the government to government level, but also at the people to people level, ties went about really smoothly. But we definitely also want to understand how maybe the Bangladeshis and Sri Lankans view each other and how they view Pakistan, because I think in the Indian neighborhood, there's never a quiet day. And it helps to understand how people kind of perceive countries based on largely what their government's policies have looked like towards them or towards the neighborhood. So I think these data points could be very helpful in that regard.
Yeah, I agree. And then one just final point about, in Bangladeshi views of India is that we often know that attitudes might change when there's a leadership change in the country. We see that in attitudes towards the United States, for example, when the president changes, we see pretty large changes in international attitudes towards the U.S. So we would expect, especially in a place that's close to each other, where there's more knowledge about the political systems within each country, there might be a change. And that's why we keep on asking these questions year after year, because we do know that it's not a static thing, that people's opinions do change, and they often change because of very clear reasons. Although not always. We can't always know why opinions change, but sometimes it's pretty obvious. So yeah, when looking at views towards Sri Lanka, for example, 45% of Bangladeshis and 43% of Indians have a favorable view of Sri Lanka. This is also the case, though, that there's about a third of respondents in both of those countries who don't have an opinion of Sri Lanka. And then too, with that data, there's also an interesting split both in Bangladesh and India among religious groups. So Hindus, those who practice Hinduism, are much more likely to have a positive view of Sri Lanka in Bangladesh and India than those who are practicing Muslims. So there's an interesting kind of religious divide when it comes to views of Sri Lanka. When it comes to Bangladesh, generally views are a little more mixed, I would say. Sri Lankans tend to view Bangladesh positively, 47% favorable versus 19% unfavorable, with about 34% who do not know. Indians are a bit more split. Actually, the most common response is don't know when it comes to views of Bangladesh in India. And again, there's not much difference in terms of views of Bangladesh by religion, but it is definitely something that there's a lot of uncertainty in India, especially the 39% is pretty high. So that's interesting to say. And then, just to jump into the views of Pakistan, this is where we kind of see a little more negative views, especially in India. In the current survey, only 12% of Indians have a positive view of Pakistan, and 61% have a negative view of Pakistan. So when you look at Bangladesh versus Pakistan, to me, it's kind of interesting that views of Bangladesh among Indians is positive to almost neutral. And then when you look at views of Pakistan, it's much more negative. And obviously, this is because of the history between the two countries, the war, that was fought. And that is a constant issue. And then you also have, again, that kind of, there's a difference among different subgroups in India in views towards Pakistan. And I'll also say this too. Last year when we surveyed, 19% had a favorable view of Pakistan. So that has actually declined 7 points since last year in India. So it's not just low, it's relatively low with a whole history of polling that we've done in Pakistan. So that's also an interesting trend when you look at it. So that's a lot of data. I just threw it at your listeners, but happy to clarify any point or talk more about what this data means and any more demographic information that you might be interested in.
I think these are all extremely useful data points. And of course, the internet is forever. So our listeners can come back and, take their time to analyze this however they want to. But I think it's really interesting that Pakistan continues to evoke, anecdotally at least, from my understanding, it continues to evoke a visceral reaction. And as you rightly said, it's because of the fact that the histories and the religious interlinkages are kind of deep rooted, right? And they're even in recent memory, regardless of maybe generational gaps, so on and so forth, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's indeed definitely an interesting data point. But I'm also curious, just to quickly follow up, is there an educational divide in how Indians view Pakistan? Does maybe the level of education determine how positively or negatively a neighbor is viewed, or do maybe those with a different level of education usually go for a do not know response based on how informed or how much of non-informed they are, if I can put it that way?
So, I mean, we can get a little more into this when we talk about the methods employed in doing surveys, but there is a fairly large chunk of people who don't have an opinion. And yes, it tends to be those with less education. Women are less likely to answer some of these international affairs questions in these countries too. Yeah. So you do see gaps in those who, do not know. In Indian views of Pakistan, that's one where there's actually a slightly less kind of don't know category, again, because it's such a, as you said, a visceral kind of issue. But even even among these groups, there's not much of an education split when it comes to views of Pakistan, but there are kind of those kinds of splits when it comes to some of the other countries that we ask about. And that might be just knowledge of that country, which is kind of coming out. If you have an opinion, it might lean towards one way or another if you know more about that country, for example. There's also like a political division here, although it's not particularly large, but those who support the ruling party in India are more likely to have a negative opinion of Pakistan, which makes sense given the politics of the country and what we know of the coalitions within India, especially the two largest coalitions. So that is always an interesting thing to see these, divisions by party. And then I don't know if I actually mentioned it, but Sri Lankans and Bangladeshis are generally positive on Pakistan, but less so than they are on India. So, when you compare Sri Lankan views of India and Pakistan, Sri Lankans are about 21% more likely to have a favorable view of India than they are Pakistan. And when you look at the Bangladeshis, it's about 17-point difference, more favorable towards India than Pakistan. So generally, India has a higher, as a country, has a better reputation among these two countries than Pakistan. Although views up towards Pakistan in those two countries are more positive than they are in India.
Right. I think, this set of data points as well is also extremely interesting because there are so many reasons that you can think of why this may or may not be. And of course, to my mind, the idea that there is that 21 and 17-point difference of how the Sri Lankans and the Bangladeshis view India and Pakistan respectively could also be motivated by the impact and implications of Pakistani politics and geopolitics, not just how it plays out in India, but also how it plays out in the region as a whole and how it may have impacted, the functioning of some of the groupings that we used to hold very dear, such as the SARC and so on and so forth. So, I mean, of course, the speculation can run wild, but that's just the first thought that comes to my mind. But thank you so much for that, Mr. Poushter. And if I can just also maybe ping back to a survey that Pew Research Center conducted last year, and this is again on views of India. And this was a little bit beyond the region, where international views of entities such as the European Union, the UK, France, so on and so forth, were also assessed. And these views weren't just of India, but also of the current dispensation under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So in that regard, are there any kind of trends or patterns of note in your assessment of these various international stakeholders? And were there any counterintuitive results, or maybe results that maybe conventional wisdom would or anecdote would dictate isn't really possible?
Yeah, so last year we surveyed in fewer countries last year. So it was only 24 countries. And for this kind of analysis, we kind of excluded India in terms of views of India. So we asked the question of, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of India in 23 countries? And we found generally, people were more favorable to India than not. So in the United States, for example, 51% had a favorable view of India, but 44% had an unfavorable view of India, which, is relatively high in my assessment. And then there were other countries that had much more positive views of India than not. So India had more than 60% positive ratings in the UK. Obviously, the close historical connection there is part of that. And then, Israel, Kenya, Nigeria also had fairly positive views of India. Places where views were a little more negative, 51% in South Africa, for example, had an unfavorable view of India in 2023. So that's an interesting trend too. But overall, when you look at the across the 23 countries, 46% had a favorable view of India, 34% had a negative view of India, and 16% didn't know. And views of the Prime Minister Modi were a little more mixed, with a lot more people not having an opinion, not as well known, although he is one of the few people that we can ask about in our survey that is kind of internationally recognized. There was also some, trending a little more downward in views towards India among some of those European countries. So that's an interesting trend to see if that kind of holds over time. And that was from, I think, 2019 to 2023. So it was kind of like a 4-year gap and some declines in some of those European countries. So we'll see what happens there in terms of the future. And then one thing that was more clear is that, most people around the world said that India's influence is staying about the same. 48% said that. But Indians themselves, 68% say that India is getting stronger on the international stage. So there's a view among these countries, for example, that India is kind of keeping its international image, where Indians are much more likely to say that India is getting stronger on the international stage. So lots of good data in there. Obviously, it's kind of hard to talk about all of it, but yeah, obviously you can find it on our website, and it's something that we'll probably come back to, although this particular report was tied to the G20 in 2023. So that's why the data was kind of deployed.
Right. I think they are all indeed extremely interesting data points and patterns. And I mean, I'm still surprised looking at the numbers, right? I do not understand why 51% of the South Africans surveyed have a negative view of India. And, there isn't necessarily a bone of contention in maybe India-Netherlands relations or India-Spain relations. And yet we see those very high numbers on the and leaning towards the unfavorable spectrum, right? So definitely those remain mysteries to me. But like you said, there can be a bunch of factors with regards to differences in how India and the Western countries perceive issues surrounding democracy or human rights, so on and so forth. Or it could altogether be something completely different. A diplomat snubbed another diplomat in a country and we don't know about it. So, but they do. I mean, like I said, the speculation runs wild here. But I am curious, did the G20 period have an impact on the patterns of how people in these countries perceive India standing at the global status? For example, if this was a question that you'd kind of looked at in the past, or did the numbers rise? So say, were the numbers lesser than 48% and have now risen in the last year because of said kind of G20 presidency?
Yeah, no, I mean, we only asked views of India in these 3 countries this year. So it is a little more limited to know whether there was a change. And we didn't survey Sri Lanka and Bangladesh in the previous year. So we actually don't at the moment have trends on how the G20 might have impacted international views of India, but it would be something that we would want to turn to in the future. Again, we do often ask, questions about India in relation to great power conflicts. So, we ask about the US, we ask about China, we ask about Russia, but India is definitely in the conversation when asking about these various countries. But another kind of maybe not secret, but issue with international public opinion in these types of surveys is that questionnaire space is extremely limited. We only have so much room to ask questions, especially in like the European countries where we do phone surveys. So we can't always get everything that we want in terms of international public opinion. And then something else that you mentioned in the previous, about what people think about when they think about a country, that's actually a hard question to answer. We don't specify, do you have a favorable opinion of Indians or Indian people or the Indian government? We just say India. And that can mean a lot of things to different people. It might mean government. It might mean something else. It might mean religion. It might mean food. It might mean other cultural exports. So it's that question in and of itself is a whole survey project. What do people mean when they think about a certain country? And our job, at least I think of it as just, putting out the data and letting people kind of utilize it. If they find that there's a change in attitudes, or if one country is more negative than not, I think it's kind of up to policymakers and government officials to kind of find the reason why, because we are just reporting what people say. We do these surveys, and our job is to put out the data so that policymakers, educators, think tankers can utilize that data. But we don't want to push the data to meet any preconceived notions. So that's why we ask very general questions and try to figure that out. There have been times where we've asked specifically about like Americans versus the United States. And usually when we do something like that, we find people have more positive views of the people than they do when we just name the country. But that's to be expected, because when you talk about people, there's usually more, less likely to say negative things about other human beings. So that's just some more kind of context to that data. But I will be interested to see how those numbers play out in the future as India's role on the global stage, I think, continues to be more prominent. That's for certain in the future.
Fascinating stuff, Mr. Poushter, because I too would be really excited to see some of these numbers and patterns play out with subsequent surveys, especially on how maybe the Bangladeshis view Indians now with the regime change, or if, maybe next year different events lead to a fall or decline in numbers surrounding how countries view Indians, or how maybe Indians view other countries. And of course, I think you also rightly mentioned that these data points must be kind of general and unbiased for policymakers to maybe draw their own conclusions from it, because one of the things that I can think of right now is how there may be a policy divide in our efforts towards positioning India as, the term we use in Hindi is Vishwaguru, or the teacher for the world, or, a knowledge hub, so on and so forth. And, assume that kind of role of leadership globally. But at the same time, those efforts may not be reflecting that well in people's or government's perceptions. And so in that sense, these data points become really important for policymakers and analysts to kind of look at. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to hand over the floor now to Vanshika to maybe go into some of the logistical requirements and ways of thinking when it comes to drafting these surveys and posing the questions and so on and so forth. Over to you, Vanshika.
Thank you, Anushka, and thank you, Jacob, for giving us that very insightful information. So we discussed a lot of numbers, and I think you also put it into context for us about how we should not perhaps overread all of that data, right? So now just coming to the research methodology that Pew uses to conduct these surveys, because I think that is the very backbone of objective survey. So Pew employs different modes of surveying, such as face-to-face surveys, phone interviews, online surveys. So I'm very curious to know how these different modes affect the response patterns. And I think a while ago, we also discussed the don't know option that the surveys give. But as I understand, a lot of surveys do not explicitly give this option to the respondents. However, in face-to-face or phone surveys, Pew does give the option to skip questions. So there is a skipping of effect that has been observed, say, in some methods compared to others. So how do you think these modes affect response patterns, and how do you account for it?
Right. So, as you said, the mode does matter a lot in terms of how you administer a question, and it does have effects in terms of the respondent. So, as you said, there are three primary modes that we employ. One is online. We do that in only two countries. We do that in the United States and Australia. And here it's people answering questions themselves. So we call that a self-administered interview. And what this allows for is people to kind of be a little more private in terms of their assessments. Sometimes there's certain biases that come up when you have an interviewer, which is someone asking you the question, whether it's phone or face-to-face, versus when you fill out the interview yourself online, for example. And that can actually sometimes elicit more honest, per se, results, because people don't feel like they need to satisfy the interview in terms of what they think the interview might want them to say. So that is a real thing. And we know that that can affect attitudes on certain questions, certain sensitive questions, especially. So as I said, we do 2 surveys online using nationally representative probability panels in the US and Australia. In the Western European countries and East Asia, so that's Japan, South Korea, and Canada, we do telephone interviews. These are interviews that have, a random digit dial, which means that any person with a phone has a chance of being selected for these interviews. And they're done over the phone, so you don't see the interviewer, but because they're done over the phone, there's less time. Typically, if you have a interview that goes over 25 minutes, people are going to just stop answering the questions because that's just too long. So that in that mode, you definitely have people who are, it's a little more private because you don't see the other person, but at the same time, you are talking to them on the phone, you are answering questions. You do have to hear every response and answer. So sometimes there's a lot of repetitiveness, like the interviewer has to make sure that the person understands the question. There has to be questions about pronunciation, those types of issues. So those are the phone surveys. And again, those are the standard ways of doing surveys in many of these countries, but there are other methods. There's still face-to-face surveying and web panel surveying in Europe. But our trends, which have, are about 23 years old, we started most of this research in about 2002. We've tended to use phone in those countries. And we try to be consistent with mode over time because a change in mode can also affect results. And then in the middle income countries, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and a lot of other countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, we employ face-to-face surveying. And this is where interviewers actually go to people's homes and talk to them for 20 to 40 minutes about these various topics. And in these interviews, the positive thing is that there's more of a connection between the interviewer and the respondent, and they can actually kind of understand what's going on. And they allow for a little more time to talk about these issues. At the same time, there is a tendency in these face-to-face interviewers for people to be non-responsive or to not want to answer a question. And as you mentioned earlier, we do have, in every time we ask a question for the phone and face-to-face surveys, there's a don't know and refused option, but those are volunteer, which means that the interviewer will ask the question. If the person says they don't know, they'll ask the question again, just to make sure, are you sure you don't have an opinion? And then if they say, no, I don't know, or I don't want to answer this question, then we put them in the don't know refused category. And especially on international affairs content, so views towards the US, China, international threats, views towards India, those kinds of questions, there tends to be a higher don't know response in a lot of these middle income countries. And that's partly because of the mode, but partly because of the subject matter. And so sensitive subject matters which people really don't have an opinion on, we do find that there's more people who say don't know. And, if you think about day-to-day life, most people don't think about these topics that we ask about too often. So the don't know responses tend to be higher on views towards the international affairs than they would be of how often do you vote, or, how often do you buy this product, or, how is the economic situation in the country today? Or even do you have a favorable view of the internet, of the leader of your country versus the leader of another country, where your country you know more about, you're more likely to answer. The other country, you might be a little more reluctant to answer questions about. So that's how we deal with mode effects. I could talk for a long time about this. So I'm going to just keep it there and see if you have any other questions when it comes to that particular topic.
Right. So this is not specifically regarding the mode. We've discussed that, but something that you said about how there are sometimes a lot of sensitive topics that you need to ask about, right? So I think here the question comes as to how those questions are framed, especially around sensitive topics like religion or political polarization. So as I understand, the Global Attitude Survey uses a 4-point scale question method where, you're trying to understand the direction, whether people have a positive or negative view, or the magnitude or intensity of people's opinion, whether it's very, very positive or very negative, somewhat or not too much. So what parameters go into trying to understand what type of question would be the most appropriate and most perhaps representative?
Yeah, I've had colleagues who often, survey research is a science in that there are tried and true methods for how to survey a random population and how to conduct those surveys in a way that elicits the most accurate responses you can get. And we know it works because generally in most election polling, it's pretty accurate. Election polling is a whole different argument, but you do see the general contours working, that we can get random samples, we can ask people questions. On the other hand, how to ask a question and how to make sure that the responses are unbiased, that they actually reflect people's attitudes is very difficult. So one way we do that, as you said, is a scale. It's called a Likert scale. It's one way of kind of putting emphasis on the more extreme categories and combining them to make sure that you're getting a general sense of attitudes. But that's just one way of doing it. There's other ways you can ask questions. You can do something called a forced choice question, where you give people one option or the other option, and they basically have to choose one or the other. We also have something called an open-ended question, where someone can kind of answer in any way that they want. The problem with that one is then we have to code that into something that's kind of numerically understandable, and that is a big effort to do. But we also have questions like, as you said, like religion, and those are more kind of preset depending on the country that we're in. So we usually have a set of, religions that we know are common in that country, and people can answer among those. But if they don't answer among those given ones, they can volunteer something else. So it really does depend on the question in terms of how we craft it. A lot of our more basic questions, like on views towards international organizations or actors or India or US or whatever, do use those 4-point Likert scales because they do tend to have the best response. But there is even current research that's kind of pointing out that a lot of people like to have a middle category. Sometimes people don't want to answer a question and they're not sure, so they want to be in the middle. And so there's some debate about whether a 5-point scale is better than a 4-point scale. And there's even instances where there are 10-point or 100-point scales. There's something called for that.
Right. Thank you. So one last question from my end, after which I'd like Anushka to take over. So most of these surveys are cross-national studies, right? And so there are certain challenges when it comes to ensuring the comparability of data across multiple languages and cultures. So how do you manage those challenges that you face?
That is a really difficult challenge. So we do it in a couple of ways. One, we are the creator of the questionnaire. So the questions that are crafted are all from Pew Research Center. We elicit outside help when it comes to topic, when it comes to issues that we might not be sure of. Obviously, we do a lot of research to understand the political situation in various countries to make sure we're asking the right question. And we have vendors, which are usually based in the country in which we survey. And they have much more knowledge about the country, about how people will respond, the political situation, the religious situation. We rely on them a lot to help us guide in what types of questions to ask. But generally, we develop those questions to be as universal as possible because we know we're going to ask them across very different countries. Countries, different levels of education, different levels of economic development, different histories, different racial and ethnic groups, different gender and age demographics. And knowing all this, we try to be very general with crafting that original questionnaire, which we do in English. And because of that, we have actually a firm that we use called Capstan, which helps us translate these questions into the various local languages that we're going to survey in. In India, that could be 10 to 18 languages. So we have to make sure that the question is comparable across those various languages. And we use, that translation firm to help us figure that out. And then we also obviously ask the same question each year in the same way with the same translation. So it's very important to be consistent over time with those translations and with the questions that we ask, especially the ones that we ask very frequently. So that's step one, making sure that it's a universal questionnaire that's translated accurately in each of the countries in which we survey. The second part of it is making sure that the methods are relatively the same when we deploy these surveys. So that means making sure that the interviewers are doing their jobs, that we're getting random samples within these countries, that the demographics match the actual, parameters within each of the country, and that we are reaching all people. We strive for nationally representative surveys, and that's a big word, but basically it means that everyone in the country should have the same chance of being selected for our survey. And those methods ensure that the translated questionnaire and the interviewer can reach the right amount of people. And then once we do get data back, we use our own kind of insight in terms of trends to make sure that the data looks good. We check for various issues that might happen in the fielding process, like interviewers might be finishing the interviews too quick, or their people might be straight lining, which means they're answering, the same response to every question, no matter what the topic is. So we do a lot of quality control checks as well to ensure that the data is up to our standards. And then, of course, we have to analyze the data. And we try to do that as universally as possible, which means like we break people into age categories across countries, education across countries. In fact, making sure that educational attainment is equivalent across the various countries is a pretty big job. The same is for income when we're looking at those demographics. So there is some standardization that comes in at the end when we start doing the analysis. And then, of course, we have to write up the results knowing the recent history or what's going on in that country, and that can sometimes also add an extra layer of scrutiny to the data itself to make sure that it's consistent across these countries. So that's a pretty long-winded question. Answer to your question, but yeah, it's a pretty involved process, and that's why our surveys, the next year's questionnaire, for example, we started doing that in June of this year, and we're not going to get final data back till May of next year. So this takes a year to deploy a survey and then another year to analyze the survey. And we kind of have overlapping projects. So we're writing off of the 2024 survey, but we've already started developing, and we're actually pretty far into development for the 2025 survey.
Right. All of that's really interesting to know. And I think for me personally, this was a 101 on at least understanding the depth and the challenge that comes with conducting an excellent quality survey, which, many of our listeners know. Pew has been in the game for a long time, right? So this was really fascinating to know. And I'll have one final question for you, Mr. Poushter, in the interest of time before we kind of conclude this episode. And, I wanted to ask about what you personally or what maybe the team at Pew would think about how important surveying people's perceptions of another country or another country's peoples are in kind of determining government policy. So have there been any trends or patterns that perhaps you or the Pew Research Center may have surveyed when it comes to analyzing how the people of a country look at another country, and then how the government of that country kind of conducts diplomacy or relations with the other country in question? Because at Takshashila, we believe that people's perceptions kind of put a ceiling and a floor to how high or how low a government can take its relationship with another government. And maybe is that something that you agree with, or do government policies and government relations, are they always detached from what people have to say about?
Yeah, so our mission is to lay a foundation of facts so that policymakers, general public, educators, whoever it might be, can utilize those facts for their own purposes. And some of that, does relate to diplomacy. Some of it is academic in background. Some of it is just general knowledge. People are just interested in how people perceive the US, how people perceive China, how people perceive India, how people perceive Russia, views towards democracy, international threats. So we find an interest in just collecting this data for general use. But at the same time, too, we do know that governments utilize this data. We do get asked to kind of present this data to government officials, both in the US and abroad. And I think from my perspective, our role is to kind of present the data as is, but to also note the limitations of what we're doing here. our goal is to give a voice to the people, that by doing these surveys, these nationally representative surveys, we're asking people questions that they might not think about on a day-to-day basis. We're asking it in a way to try to be as neutral as possible in terms of the outcome, the policy outcome especially. And because of that, I think we have a lot of, ability to speak to the issues that policymakers are interested in without actually talking about policy. So we've always ingrained in our culture to be, humble about what we're doing. We do this not to say that this is the right way or this is the wrong way. We know that, the interviewers, the interviewees, the respondents have lives outside of what we're asking them. And, respect for their views, respect for their opinions is kind of ingrained in how we think about this research. And so we do whatever we can to make sure that it's as solid methodological foundation, that we're not kind of putting our own biases, our own thoughts, our own history into this. And that's hard. Obviously, we're human too. We're not machines. We do have opinions on various things in our day-to-day lives, but we try to be as neutral as possible because we respect what people think. And we do think it's a value add to especially democratic society, because opinions, free thought, free expression, we can't do a survey if the people won't respond to it or if the government won't let us do it. And there are countries where we cannot do surveys because we're just not allowed to because of the law or because it's too difficult or it's too dangerous, which is a limitation in public opinion research. I will say outright that it tends to be easier in certain countries than others. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're offering as unvarnished, accurate information as possible. And, discussions like this help to kind of fill that out. We can't always say this when we're writing a report, when we're just relaying the numbers, but there is a lot that goes into this. And it's always good for people when they're looking at a poll to make sure they know, who did the survey, why they did the survey, what were the methods employed. And by being transparent and open, and we release all our data sets online eventually. Anyone can download them. And by providing that, transparent and, free thinking source, we hope that bolsters public opinion in general and that people do utilize it, for any means they might feel necessary. But I will say, there are limitations to it. It's not the end all be all. There's other ways to influence people. There's other ways to track people in terms of what they do and what they say. But to us, public opinion is just one of those fundamental things that, we think are important for world society.
Right. No, thank you so much for that. And it's always a delight to look at the transparency that you talked about. We've been able to read up on the methodology deployed in certain Pew surveys. We've been able to look at the data. And of course, the way in which the data has been presented in Pew reports, of course, like you said, then also influences policy. And most prominently, it happens in democratic societies, which is why it becomes all the more important for India and Indians to understand not just the value as well as the challenges that come with surveying public opinion, but also put data points and patterns gathered to good use. And at Takshashila, we're now attempting to kind of enter the world of surveys ourselves. And we recently concluded a survey assessing Indians' views of India-China relations and India's China policy, the results for which will again be something that we'll be discussing in a subsequent podcast and launching a report for the same. But a lot of it has come from learning from how Pew kind of deploys its survey methods, how to kind of use the Likert scale, and how to create general questions. So thank you so much for that. And in addition to also sharing with us your very valuable insights, this was an extremely interesting and fascinating chat, not just for me, I also hope for Vanshika and our listeners. And with this, I'd also like to say thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.